I opened the front door expecting carolers or maybe a neighbor with a plate of cookies. Instead, I found my daughter standing in the snow with her 5-year-old on her hip mascara, frozen halfway down her cheeks, and I understood in that instant that somebody had made the worst mistake of their life. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. 30 years in the army teaches you that the moment for noise is never the moment that matters. What matters is the moment after the one where you decide what you're going to do about it. And I already knew. The snow had been falling since noon, the kind of heavy, quiet snow that makes a street look like a postcard, like nothing bad could possibly happen underneath it. I'd just gotten home from base that afternoon, my duffel still sitting unopened by the stairs, and I was standing in my kitchen slicing a ham for a dinner I fully expected to eat alone. My husband Frank had been gone 6 years now, heart not combat, though he would have laughed at how disappointed people always seemed when I told them that. My daughter Emily had her own house across town, her own family, her own Christmas Eve plans that didn't usually include me until the 26th. I was fine with that. I'd raised her to build a life bigger than mine, and she had. The doorbell rang at 11:40. I remember the time because I looked at the oven clock and thought that's late for carolers. When I opened the door, Emily was standing on the porch with Sophie wrapped in a blanket that wasn't warm enough for the weather, both of them shivering snow, already collecting in Emily's hair, like she'd been standing there longer than she should have. Her car was running at the curb behind her, hazards, blinking 2 garbage bags of clothes sitting in the back seat where a car seat should have been secured, properly thrown in without thought, without care. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. "Can we stay here tonight?" I didn't ask why. I could see why. I could see it in the way she was holding Sophie too tight, the way her eyes kept darting back toward the car like she was afraid someone was going to come after her. I stepped back and pulled the door wide. "Get inside, both of you, now." Sophie's small hand found mine as she passed through the doorway, and she looked up at me with the particular kind of confusion only a 5-year-old carries, the sense that something enormous has happened, and no one will explain it to her in words she understands. "Grandma," she whispered, "did Daddy stop loving us?" I felt something in my chest go very still the way it used to go, still right before I gave an order in the field when there wasn't room left for feeling, only for function. I knelt down to her eye level, brushed the snow from her hair, and told her the only true thing I could offer in that moment. "Daddy made a big mistake tonight, sweetheart. But you didn't do anything wrong, not one thing. Now let's get you warm." I got them both inside, wrapped Sophie in the throw blanket from the couch, and sat Emily down at the kitchen table with a mug of hot chocolate she didn't touch. She stared at the steam rising off it like she was watching something burn. It took her almost 10 minutes to speak again, and when she did, the words came out in fragments the way people talk when they're still inside the shock and haven't caught up to their own sentences yet. Ryan had brought another woman into their home. Tonight. Christmas Eve. While Sophie was asleep upstairs. Emily had come down for a glass of water and found them in the living room. This woman's coat already hung on the rack like she belonged there, like she'd been there before. And when Emily tried to speak, tried to even form the question, Ryan's mother, Linda, had appeared from the hallway, already there, already in on it, and told Emily, calm as anything, that it might be best if she took Sophie somewhere else for the night. Not asked, told. They hadn't even let her pack properly. Linda had thrown some of Emily's things into bags while Ryan stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching, saying nothing, offering nothing. And then the door had locked behind her. I listened to every word without interrupting, my hands flat on the table, my breathing even. This is a skill you learn commanding people through the worst nights of their lives. You let them finish the report before you react to it. Reacting early means you miss details, and details are where the truth lives. When Emily finished, she looked at me with the same face she'd had at 8 years old after her first heartbreak, waiting for me to tell her it would be okay, waiting for comfort. I gave her something different. I gave her my full attention, and I let her see that I was no longer just her mother sitting at a kitchen table. I was thinking, calculating. Already 3 steps ahead of a man who had no idea what he'd just done, or who he'd just done it to. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch by the time I walked Emily to the guest room, tucking a second blanket around her shoulders even though the house was warm. At the doorway, she turned back to look at me, eyes red and swollen but steadier than they'd been an hour ago. What do we do now, Mom? I looked out the hallway window at the snow still falling over the quiet street, at my daughter's car parked crooked at the curb where she'd abandoned it in a hurry, at the 2 garbage bags of a life someone had tried to throw away in one night. Get some sleep, I told her. Tomorrow we start putting things in order. I walked back downstairs alone, poured myself a small glass of the whiskey I kept for occasions that actually called for it, and stood at the window a long time watching the snow bury the tire tracks in the driveway. Somewhere across town, a man was probably celebrating, pouring champagne, congratulating himself on getting away with something. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He thought he'd humiliated a schoolteacher and sent her running to her mother's house for comfort and casseroles. He had no idea that the woman standing in that kitchen had commanded soldiers through Kandahar, had signed off on operations that decided the fate of entire units, had spent 30 years learning exactly how to dismantle something piece by piece without ever raising her voice. Before I turned off the porch light, I said it quietly, mostly to myself, mostly for my own resolve. Get in the car, girls, they're about to learn who they messed with. The morning after Christmas Eve arrived gray and quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over a house after a storm has already done its damage. I was up before both of them, the coffee maker humming in the kitchen, Sophie's cartoons already queued up on the tablet so she'd have something familiar to hold on to. Routine, even a borrowed one, is its own kind of medicine. I'd learned that, a long time ago, you give people something normal to do with their hands, and it buys their mind time to catch up to what's happened. Emily came down around 9, hollow-eyed, wrapped in one of Frank's old flannel shirts that still hung in the guest closet. She sat across from me at the table, wrapped both hands around her mug like she needed the heat more than the coffee, and for a while neither of us said anything. I let the silence sit. I'd learned that too. People tell you the real story once they've run out of the version they think you want to hear. I should have seen it, she finally said. I think some part of me did see it, and I just kept choosing not to look. I didn't offer comfort yet. I asked a question instead, the kind I used to ask soldiers giving me an incomplete report. How long, Emily, She let out a breath that seemed to take something structural out of her when it left. A year, maybe longer. I found messages back in the spring and he swore it was over, that it had been a mistake, that he'd end it. I believed him because I wanted to. Because Sophie needed her father in the house, and because... She stopped herself, jaw tightening. Because I'd already put everything I had into that house, Mom. Everything. That detail caught me the way a loose thread catches a soldier's eye on an otherwise clean uniform, small but wrong, worth pulling. What do you mean, everything? It came out slowly at first, then faster, like she'd been carrying the full weight of it alone for years and was only now setting it down. The down payment on the house had come almost entirely from her savings, and a small inheritance from Frank's side of the family. Money I'd made sure she had specifically so she'd never be without a floor under her feet. Ryan's business, a landscaping and property services company he'd built up with plenty of noise and not nearly enough discipline, had been bleeding money for 2 years. She'd covered payroll for his crew more than once. She'd paid off a business loan out of her own teacher's salary when a bank had threatened to seize equipment. And every single time Ryan had let her do it, then turned around and reminded her in that particular tone, men like him use exactly whose name was on the mortgage and whose name wasn't. He used to say it like a joke, Emily said. Without me you'd have nothing, but it was never really a joke, Mom. It was a warning. I felt my jaw set, but I kept my voice level because Emily didn't need my anger stacked on top of her own right now. She needed my judgment. There's a difference, and it's a difference I've spent a career learning to protect. Do you have documentation, bank statements, loan paperwork, anything showing what you put into that house and that business? She blinked, surprised by the direction of the question, and then nodded slowly. I think so. I kept things. I don't know why, habit, maybe. Emily, the organized one. A small broken laugh. I guess some part of me knew I might need it someday. Get it, all of it, today if you can. By early afternoon, Emily had driven back to a storage unit she kept near her school, thankfully something Ryan had never bothered to ask about, and returned with a banker's box of folders, receipts, printed emails and bank statements going back 3 years. I spread them across my dining table, put on my reading glasses, and went through every page the way I used to review intelligence reports, slowly, without assumption, looking for the pattern underneath the noise. What I found confirmed what Emily already suspected, and then went further than either of us expected. Ryan's business had 2 accounts I didn't recognize from the paperwork she'd seen at home. Small transfers, a few thousand at a time, moved regularly to an account under the company's name, rather than his personal one. There were emails referencing a Phase 2 investment that Emily had never heard mentioned. And there was a name, appearing again and again in calendar invitations and receipts for dinners. Neither Emily nor Sophie had attended the same woman I assumed standing in that living room the night before with her coat already on the rack. Ryan hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been quietly restructuring hiding assets inside the business, keeping Emily's name off documents she should have been on, all while letting her keep paying the bills that kept the lights on. I sat back in my chair and took off my glasses, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Emily watched me with the particular anxiety of someone waiting for a verdict. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking your husband made 2 mistakes," I said. "The first was underestimating you. The second was underestimating who your mother happens to know." I picked up my phone and scrolled until I found the contact I was looking for, Patricia Reyes, a name I hadn't dialed in almost 2 years. Patricia and I had served together decades ago, back when she was a young JAG officer, and I was a Green captain who trusted her legal instincts more than my own occasionally. She'd left the service years before I did, and built a formidable civilian practice specializing in exactly the kind of case sitting in folders across my dining table. She picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice warm with genuine surprise. "Michelle Anderson, it's been too long. Please tell me this is a social call." "It isn't," I said, "but I think you're going to enjoy this one anyway." I gave her the short version, the affair, the mother-in-law's cruelty, the hidden accounts, the years of Emily quietly propping up a man who'd never once acknowledged what she'd sacrificed for him. Patricia listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers and good officers both learned to do, and when I finished there was a pause on the line before she spoke again. "We're not going to do this with shouting matches and slammed doors," she said. "We're going to do this with paper, evidence, a record so clean and so complete that by the time we're finished there won't be a single question left for anyone to argue about." "That's exactly what I want," I said, looking across the table at my daughter, who was watching me with something new in her expression, not just grief anymore, but the first flicker of hope. No shouting, no scenes, just the truth laid out so plainly that even his mother won't be able to talk her way around it. Emily reached across the table and gripped my hand, and I gripped hers back, thinking of every operation I'd ever run where patience had won out over impulse, where the quiet, methodical approach had accomplished what anger never could. "We're going to do this the right way," I told her, "and when it's finished, Ryan Collins is going to understand exactly what he threw away." 3 days after Christmas, Ryan Collins threw a party. I heard about it the way most humiliating details eventually surface through a mutual acquaintance, a neighbor of Emily's who felt obligated to mention it, so you'd be prepared. Apparently, Ryan had hosted a small New Year's gathering at the house, the same house Emily had helped pay for, with the same woman from Christmas Eve standing at his side like she'd been installed there permanently. Linda had been in attendance too, playing hostess in her son's living room, telling guests that Emily had run off and that the family was finally getting some peace. Emily heard the story secondhand and sat very still at my kitchen table for a long moment before she spoke. "He's celebrating," she said, like the word itself tasted strange in her mouth. "Let him," I said. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and I understood why. To her, in that moment, celebration looked like winning. She hadn't yet learned what I already knew from 30 years of watching overconfident men make their worst decisions in the open, thinking no one competent was paying attention. A man who celebrates before the fight is finished is a man who has already told you exactly how careless he's about to be. He confirmed it within the week. Ryan filed for divorce first, apparently on the advice of Linda, who seemed to believe that whoever moved first in a legal proceeding automatically held the advantage. His filing painted Emily as unstable, prone to erratic emotional outbursts, a mother whose fitness should be reviewed by the court, a laughable accusation from a man who'd had another woman in his living room while his daughter slept upstairs. Patricia read the filing out loud to us over speakerphone, her voice carrying the dry amusement of someone who has seen this particular strategy fail more times than she could count. "He's trying to get ahead of the narrative," Patricia said. Make himself the reasonable one before anyone can prove otherwise. It's common. It's also going to backfire spectacularly once the financial records come out. While Ryan was busy managing appearances, he was also busy doing something far more damaging to himself: moving money. Patricia's paralegal, working through the documents Emily had provided along with new records subpoenaed from the business accounts, found a pattern of transfers that had accelerated dramatically in the 2 weeks since Christmas. Equipment listed as company assets had been quietly sold. A second business account, one Emily had never had access to, had received several deposits that didn't match any client invoice on file. It looked exactly like what it was: a man trying to hide what he could before a judge got a chance to divide it. Linda, meanwhile, seemed to have appointed herself head of public relations for her son's reputation, which meant she'd taken to social media with the subtlety of a woman who had never once considered that the internet is in fact permanent. She posted about ungrateful daughters-in-law and women who don't appreciate a good provider. Vague enough to claim she wasn't talking about anyone specific. Obvious enough that half of Emily's old friend group reached out privately to ask if she was okay. One post in particular aged badly within days. Some people run home to mommy the second things get hard. Emily will come crawling back once she realizes what she gave up. I read that one twice, sitting alone in my study with my reading glasses pushed up on my head, and I felt something settle in me, not rage, something colder and more useful than rage. Certainty. Ryan, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by my presence in his life. From what Emily gathered through the lawyer's correspondence, he'd mentioned me exactly once to his own attorney, describing me as Emily's mother, retired military, not really a factor here. He assumed, as men like him often do, that a 52-year-old woman who spoke quietly and didn't raise her voice in rooms full of louder people was someone to be managed rather than someone to be reckoned with. He had built an entire understanding of me out of the fact that I hadn't shown up at his house, screaming, hadn't called him at midnight, hadn't done any of the things an angry mother in a movie might do. He mistook my silence for absence. That was his second mistake, and it was larger than his first. While he sold off equipment and posted vague reassurances to business partners that everything was under control, Patricia's team kept building. They pulled bank records showing a consistent months-long pattern of payments to a rented apartment across town, an apartment, it turned out, that had been leased under the company's name as a business expense, paid for with funds that should have belonged jointly to Ryan and Emily. They found email threads between Ryan and the other woman, casual and unguarded in the way people write when they've never once imagined anyone would read them in a courtroom. They found receipts for dinners, for jewelry, for a weekend trip to Charleston that had been logged internally as a client retreat, despite there being no client, no itinerary, and no business purpose whatsoever attached to it. Every discovery came to me in a phone call from Patricia, delivered with the same clipped professionalism she'd have used briefing a commanding officer. And every time my response was the same 2 words spoken without heat, without theater, simply as an instruction to keep the operation moving forward exactly as planned. Keep digging. Emily, watching all of this unfold from the guest room she and Sophie now called home, began to change in small, visible ways. The hollow look in her eyes started to give way to something sharper. She stopped flinching every time her phone buzzed with Ryan's name. She started sleeping through the night again, mostly. Sophie, too, seemed to sense the shift in the house. She laughed more at dinner, stopped asking every evening whether her father was going to call. One evening after Sophie had gone to bed, Emily found me in the study going over a fresh batch of financial documents Patricia had sent over. "Do you think he has any idea what's coming?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. I looked up at her, at the daughter I'd raised to be kind and patient and generous to a fault, sitting there now with something new steadying her spine. "No," I said. "I don't think he has the faintest idea. Men like Ryan believe confidence is the same thing as control. He's about to learn the difference the hard way." Outside, the first snow of the new year had started to fall again, soft against the study window, and I thought about the version of Ryan Collins throwing his little party 3 days after Christmas, toasting to a future he had no idea was already being dismantled piece by piece, document by document, exactly the way I'd been trained to dismantle anything that threatened the people under my command. He thought the fight was over. It hadn't even started yet. By the middle of January, Ryan Collins still believed he held every card in the game he thought he was playing. That belief, more than anything else, became the engine of his own undoing. Confidence untested by consequence has a way of hardening into carelessness, and carelessness in a divorce proceeding involving hidden assets is a gift no opposing counsel ever turns down. He kept selling, a commercial mower here, a trailer there, a piece of equipment listed on the company books as obsolete, despite having been purchased 8 months earlier. Patricia's team tracked each sale as it hit the record, cataloging the pattern with the patience of people building a case brick by brick, rather than trying to win with a single dramatic blow. I understood that patience intimately. It's the same discipline that wins wars nobody sees happening until the outcome is already decided. Linda, unfortunately for her son, had not learned the value of silence either. Her social media commentary escalated rather than cooled, emboldened by the small chorus of friends who liked and commented in agreement, none of whom seemed to grasp that every post was quietly being archived by Emily's legal team as evidence of a hostile, coordinated effort to isolate and humiliate her. One particular post, in which Linda referred to Emily as a woman who never understood how good she had it, was later printed and placed directly into the case file right next to a bank statement showing Emily's teaching salary had covered Ryan's business insurance for 6 consecutive months the previous year. The real turning point came at the end of the month when Patricia filed for an emergency court order freezing the disputed business accounts. I remember the exact moment she called to tell me the judge had granted it, a Tuesday afternoon, gray light coming through my kitchen window, Sophie doing her spelling homework at the table beside me. "It's done," Patricia said. "As of this morning, Ryan doesn't have access to the accounts he's been quietly draining. Every transaction from here forward has to be accounted for." I felt something in my chest loosen slightly. Not triumph exactly, more like the particular relief of watching a plan finally click into place after weeks of careful positioning. "How's he taking it?" "Badly, from what I hear. His attorney's already asking for an emergency hearing to contest it. He's not going to get one before the accounts are fully documented, though. We made sure of that." The effects showed up almost immediately in Ryan's world, even from the outside. 2 of his longtime clients, a property management company and a homeowners association he'd serviced for years, quietly ended their contracts within days of each other, citing concerns about the stability of the business, which I suspected had less to do with actual instability and more to do with word traveling through a small business community that doesn't take kindly to a man who hides money from his wife, while his daughter watches her father move a stranger's coat onto the family coat rack. Emily told me later that a former friend of Ryan's had mentioned almost offhandedly that his once reliable crew of landscapers had started asking questions about missed paychecks. It seemed the money that had once flowed so easily toward personal indulgences had left very little cushion for actually running a company, once Emily's steady financial patchwork was no longer available to cover the gaps. And then there was the woman. Emily heard through the same grapevine that had delivered every other piece of gossip that the girlfriend, once so eager to move her coat onto that rack, had grown considerably less enthusiastic once it became clear Ryan's finances were unraveling in a very public, very legal way. Nobody signs up for a fairy tale that turns into a deposition. For the first time since Christmas Eve, Ryan seemed to understand that something had gone fundamentally wrong with his plan, not just legally, but strategically. The woman he'd dismissed as not really a factor had in fact been the single most decisive factor in the entire proceeding. I imagine it must have been a strange, disorienting realization for a man who had spent his adult life assuming that confidence and charm were sufficient substitutes for competence. He showed up at my house on a Thursday evening in early February, unannounced, his car idling crooked in the driveway, the same way Emily's had been crooked at the curb on Christmas Eve. I watched him from the front window before he even reached the porch, hands shoved in his coat pockets, shoulders drawn up around his ears, none of the swagger I'd heard described from the New Year's party. I opened the door only partway enough to be polite, not enough to invite anything resembling a conversation. "Michelle," he said, and there was something almost pleading in the way he said my name, like he thought familiarity might soften what was coming. "Can we talk just for a minute? I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding and I want to fix it before this goes any further." I looked at him for a long moment, really looked the way I used to size up a soldier trying to talk his way out of consequences he'd earned fair and square. He looked smaller than I remembered from the wedding photos on Emily's old mantel. Tired, cornered, still somehow expecting that a private conversation on my porch might undo weeks of documented verifiable fact. "There's no misunderstanding, Ryan," I said, keeping my voice even almost gentle, the way you'd speak to someone who genuinely didn't understand yet how far past the point of negotiation things had already moved. "You had an affair in your daughter's home on Christmas Eve. You hid money from your wife for over a year. Every part of what's happening to you right now you built with your own hands. I just need a chance to explain." "You'll get that chance," I said, in front of a judge with all the evidence in the room where explanations actually mean something. He opened his mouth again and I watched something in his expression shift. Not quite anger, not quite desperation. Some uneasy blend of both the look of a man realizing the ground beneath him had been quietly excavated while he wasn't paying attention. "We'll speak in court," I told him, and I closed the door. I stood in the front hallway for a moment afterward, listening to his car idle in the driveway a while longer before finally pulling away, and I felt none of the satisfaction I might have expected. Only the calm, settled certainty of a job proceeding exactly as it needed to. Upstairs, I could hear Emily reading Sophie a bedtime story, her voice steady and warm in a way it hadn't been in weeks, and I understood standing there in that quiet hallway that, whatever happened in that courtroom, we had already won back the thing that mattered most, peace restored one careful step at a time. The courtroom on the morning of the hearing smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee from the machine in the hallway. The kind of ordinary, unglamorous space where the biggest turning points of people's lives so often happen without any of the drama Hollywood assigns them. I sat in the gallery beside Emily, my hands folded in my lap, wearing a plain gray suit rather than anything resembling a uniform. I hadn't worn my dress blues to court, hadn't mentioned my rank to a single clerk on the way in. There was no need. Patricia had built this case on paper, not on intimidation, and I intended to let the paper do exactly what it had been assembled to do. Ryan walked in a few minutes after us, dressed in a suit that looked slightly too new, the kind a man buys specifically to look trustworthy in front of a judge. Linda walked beside him, chin lifted, wearing the expression of a woman who still believed against every piece of evidence stacked in the case file that her son was the wronged party in this story. She glanced toward our side of the gallery, once gave Emily a small, tight smile that had nothing warm in it, and took her seat. I could see the exact moment their confidence started to waver, though it wasn't during the opening statements, and it wasn't during Patricia's calm, methodical outline of the case. It happened when the judge walked in. Judge Catherine Whitfield settled behind the bench, glanced briefly at her docket, and then looked out over the courtroom the way judges do when they're taking a first read of the room. Her eyes moved past Ryan and Linda without pause, and then landed on me. For a moment, nothing registered on her face. And then something did, recognition, quiet and immediate, the particular look of someone placing a face they hadn't expected to see in this context. "Colonel Anderson," she said, and there was genuine warmth threaded through the formality of it. "It's been a long time." I inclined my head slightly. "Your Honor." I watched Ryan turn his head toward me slowly, the way a man turns when a sound doesn't match what he expected to hear. Linda's expression shifted from mild disdain to something closer to confusion, then alarm, as she began doing the same mental math I imagine most people in that courtroom were suddenly doing. Patricia leaned toward Emily and me for just a moment before proceedings began, her voice pitched low. "Judge Whitfield ran the legal assistance program at Fort Bragg years ago, right around the time you were coordinating veteran family support services there. She's known for being scrupulously fair, but she doesn't tolerate people who try to manipulate the process. This is good for us, not because of who you are, but because she's exactly the kind of judge who won't be swayed by anything except the facts in front of her." That I already knew. I hadn't called in any favor, hadn't reached out to Judge Whitfield in the weeks leading up to this hearing, hadn't done anything except let the case take its natural course through the system. If our paths happened to cross again in a courtroom, that was simply the shape circumstance had taken. I had built my career avoiding exactly the kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that Ryan and Linda seemed to assume I must be engaged in. The truth was far less dramatic and far more devastating for them. I hadn't needed to manipulate anything. The facts alone were enough. The hearing unfolded methodically over the next 2 hours. Patricia walked the court through the financial records, first the transfers to the second business account, the equipment sales that had accelerated the moment the divorce filing became public, the rented apartment paid for with funds that should have belonged to the marriage. Ryan's attorney objected periodically, but the paper trail was too clean, too well documented, too thoroughly cross-referenced with bank statements and email timestamps to leave much room for argument. Then came the affair itself, laid out not with accusations or emotional appeals, but with dates and receipts. The Charleston trip logged as a client retreat with no client attached. The recurring charges at restaurants Emily had never once been taken to in 3 years of marriage. The lease agreement for the apartment, signed under the company's name just 4 months after Emily had covered Ryan's business insurance out of her own salary. I watched Linda's face throughout, the way her chin, so lifted and certain at the start of the morning, began to lower by degrees as each new piece of evidence entered the record. She had spent months telling anyone who would listen that Emily was the unstable one, the ungrateful one, the woman who didn't understand what she'd given up. Sitting in that courtroom, watching the actual financial and personal history of her son's marriage read into the record piece by piece, she had nowhere left to direct that narrative. The facts had simply outpaced the story she'd been telling. Ryan, for his part, sat very still through most of it, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him rather than on the judge, or on Emily, when his attorney attempted to characterize the business transfers as standard operational adjustments. Judge Whitfield looked over her glasses with an expression that needed no further commentary and simply asked counsel to explain why standard operational adjustments so precisely tracked the timeline of the divorce filing. There was no good answer to that question, and everyone in the room understood it. Emily sat beside me through all of it, spine-straight, hands steady in her lap, watching the dismantling of a marriage she had once believed in, with the composed dignity of someone who had already done her grieving in private weeks earlier in the quiet of my guest room. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The version of Emily who had stood shivering on my porch on Christmas Eve had, somewhere in the intervening weeks, become someone who could sit in a courtroom and watch the truth speak for itself. By the time the morning recessed, there was no meaningful argument left for the defense to make. The evidence stood complete, undeniable, and entirely self-explanatory, a full accounting of exactly what kind of man Ryan Collins had chosen to be, and exactly what it had cost the people who had once trusted him. As we stood to leave for the break, I caught Linda's eye across the aisle. She looked away first. The ruling came 2 weeks after the hearing concluded, delivered in a written decision Patricia read aloud to us over the phone on a Thursday afternoon, while Sophie built a puzzle at my kitchen table, entirely unaware that her whole future had just been settled in a courthouse across town. Judge Whitfield's decision was thorough and unambiguous. Emily was awarded the majority share of the equity in the house, calculated to reflect the disproportionate amount she had personally invested in both the down payment and years of mortgage assistance drawn from her own income, while Ryan diverted business funds elsewhere. She was granted primary custody of Sophie, with Ryan receiving standard supervised visitation, pending a full review given the circumstances of his conduct. Child support was set based on his actual documented income, not the diminished figures his attorney had attempted to argue for, and the court ordered a full accounting of the hidden business transfers, with restitution owed to the marital estate for funds improperly diverted during the year leading up to the filing. It wasn't vengeance. I want to be clear about that, because there's a difference between justice and cruelty, and I had spent the entire proceeding making sure we stayed firmly on the correct side of that line. The court hadn't punished Ryan for falling out of love, hadn't punished him for being flawed or unhappy in his marriage. It had held him accountable for deception, for financial abuse, for years of quietly building an exit, while letting Emily believe she was building a life. Those are different things, and the law, when it works the way it's supposed to, knows the difference too. The fallout beyond the courtroom arrived faster than I expected. Word travels quickly in small business communities, and within a month, 2 more of Ryan's longtime clients had quietly moved their contracts elsewhere, citing vague concerns about reliability that everyone understood to mean something more specific. His crew, already unsettled by missed paychecks, earlier in the winter began looking for steadier employment. By spring, I heard through Emily's old social circle that Ryan had been forced to sell off the last of his commercial equipment simply to cover the restitution ordered by the court, effectively ending the business he'd once used as leverage to remind Emily how much she supposedly needed him. Linda didn't take any of it gracefully. She continued posting for a while, though the tone shifted from smug to bitter to eventually silent. I suspect once enough of her own friends began quietly distancing themselves from a narrative that no longer matched public record. A woman who had spent months insisting Emily would come crawling back found herself instead watching her son's entire financial and social standing dissolve in real time, with nothing she could post or say capable of reversing it. As for the woman from Christmas Eve, she disappeared from the story entirely sometime around February, according to the same grapevine that had delivered every other update over the preceding months. I don't know the details, and honestly, I never asked. It wasn't relevant to what mattered. Whatever she had signed up for clearly hadn't included months of legal proceedings, frozen accounts, and a business collapsing in slow motion. People rarely stay for the parts of a story that don't serve them. Ryan called me once about 6 weeks after the ruling. I almost didn't answer, recognizing the number, but some part of me wanted to hear what he had to say, if only to close a chapter properly rather than leave it hanging open. His voice when I picked up sounded thinner than I remembered, not defeated exactly, but hollowed out in a way that suggested the last few months had finally caught up with the version of himself he'd been so confident in back in December. "Michelle," he said, "I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I don't know who else to call. Things have gotten bad, really bad. I lost the Simmons contract this week, and I don't know how I'm going to make the restitution payment next month, and I just..." He stopped, and I could hear him take an unsteady breath on the other end. "I thought maybe you could talk to Emily. Help me get some breathing room. You're the only one who could actually convince her." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to make sure my response came from clarity rather than reflex. "Ryan," I said, "I understand you're struggling right now. I do, but I need you to hear this clearly because I don't intend to say it more than once. My daughter spent years quietly holding your business and your marriage together while you took every bit of that effort for granted. She paid your debts. She covered your insurance. She stayed loyal through a year of lies she didn't even know she was living inside of. And on Christmas Eve, you had her and your daughter standing out in the snow because you couldn't be bothered to end things honestly before bringing someone else into that house." "I know," he said quietly. "I know all of that. Then you also know that what's happening to you now isn't something I did to you. It's the natural consequence of choices you made one after another for over a year. My duty was to protect my family, not to rescue the man who tried to destroy it." He didn't argue. I think by that point some part of him understood there was nothing left to argue. He thanked me in a strange formal way for taking the call at all, and then the line went quiet and I set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment in my kitchen listening to Sophie laughing at something on the television in the next room. Emily's voice joining in, a moment later, warm and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in months. I thought standing there about all the operations I'd run over the years that had ended not with celebration, but with this same quiet, unremarkable stillness. The sense of a job completed correctly, without excess, without spectacle simply because it needed to be done, and I had been the one positioned to do it. There was no triumph in Ryan's collapse. There was only the settled knowledge that my daughter and granddaughter were safe, that the truth had been allowed to do its work, and that somewhere across town, a man was finally beginning to understand the actual cost of everything he'd once taken for granted. A year has a way of reshaping a family if you let it, and by the time the following Christmas arrived, ours looked almost nothing like the one that had shattered on my porch 12 months earlier, and everything like what it should have been all along. Emily opened her small preschool in the fall, a bright sunlit space with hand-painted letters on the windows, and a waiting list longer than she'd ever expected. She'd used part of the settlement not to rebuild the life she'd had with Ryan, but to build something entirely her own, something with her name on the door, and her judgment behind every decision made inside it. Watching her walk through those classrooms in September, greeting parents with the same steady warmth she'd once poured into a marriage that hadn't deserved it, I felt something settle in me that no courtroom victory could have given me on its own. Sophie had grown taller, louder, more herself. The quiet, watchful little girl who had once asked me on a snowy porch whether her father had stopped loving her had given way slowly and without anyone forcing it to a 6-year-old who laughed with her whole body and asked 100 questions a day about everything except the divorce. Children heal differently than adults do. They don't need explanations so much as they need stability. And stability was the one thing our house had never stopped offering her. I'd requested leave specifically to be home for this Christmas, something I rarely did, but this year felt different enough to justify it. The three of us spent the week before the holiday, doing all the small, ordinary things that had felt impossible the year before, stringing lights along the porch railing, baking too many cookies, arguing pleasantly over where the star should sit on the tree. Sophie insisted on hanging a small wooden ornament shaped like a soldier near the top. One I'd had since Frank was alive, and she patted it once she'd hung it, as though she understood in whatever way a 6-year-old understands these things that it mattered. Ryan called 2 days before Christmas, his voice careful in a way it hadn't been during that first desperate phone call months earlier. He asked humbly this time whether he might see Sophie for an hour on Christmas afternoon. Nothing elaborate, no expectations beyond a short supervised visit at a coffee shop near his apartment. His business hadn't recovered, not really. He was working for someone else's landscaping company now, rebuilding slowly. The restitution payment still chipping away at whatever he managed to save. I'd heard secondhand that he'd started attending some kind of counseling, though I didn't know the details and didn't ask. Emily considered the request for a full day before answering him, weighing it the way she now weighed most decisions carefully without the reflexive urgency to please that had once cost her so much. In the end, she agreed on her own terms at a public place for a limited window of time, not because she owed him ease, because Sophie still loved her father uncomplicated, in the way children's love so often remains, even when the adults around them have made an enormous mess of things. And Emily had decided that protecting Sophie's heart mattered more than protecting her own resentment. On Christmas afternoon, I drove them both to the coffee shop and waited in the car watching from a distance as Ryan knelt down to Sophie's height on the sidewalk, watched her run the last few steps into a hug. He clearly hadn't been certain he'd still be allowed. Emily stood a few feet back, polite, composed, entirely unwilling to pretend at a warmth she no longer felt toward him, but also entirely unwilling to let her own feelings interfere with her daughter's hour. I didn't intervene. I'd learned over the past year exactly when my presence was needed, and exactly when the best thing I could offer was simply to stand back and let my daughter handle her own life with the strength she'd more than proven she carried. Watching Ryan through the coffee shop window, something in his posture had changed since that night he'd shown up uninvited on my porch. He looked smaller in a different way now, not cornered but humbled. A man who had finally been forced to reckon honestly with the difference between the life he'd taken for granted and the life he'd actually earned through his own choices. I felt no satisfaction in that, only a quiet, distant sense that consequences, when allowed to run their natural course, tend to teach lessons far more effectively than anger ever could. We drove home as the winter light faded. Sophie chattering happily in the back seat about the hot chocolate her father had bought her, entirely unaware of how much careful, deliberate effort had gone into making sure this small, ordinary Christmas afternoon could exist at all. Emily caught my eye once in the rearview mirror, and neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep beneath the tree exhausted from a full day of celebration, Emily and I sat together in the quiet living room, the lights still glowing, the house finally fully at peace. That Christmas Eve, my daughter thought she had lost everything. She hadn't. She still had her dignity, her little girl, and a mother who never walks away from her family. Some battles aren't won on the battlefield. They're won by standing your ground when the people you love need you most. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear where it landed with you tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. We've got stories like this one waiting for you every single day, so subscribe if you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's keep this journey going together.